I'm starting a new series on rising stars of the chess world, and the first person that sprang to my mind after Alireza Firouzja was young Nodirbek Abdusattorov. So he's just 17 years old, and last year he shot to fame when he won the World Rapid Championship. An incredible achievement, making him the youngest player to ever win a World Championship event in chess history, and he was even given an apartment by the president of Uzbekistan, congratulating him for his achievement. Now, he beat all the top guns, well, lots of them anyway. He had an incredible game against Magnus Carlsen. I covered it on this channel. I'll link it at the end of the video, but today I wanted to look at the game he played against Levon Aronian with the black pieces, and this is a super fun, exciting game. Let's see what happened here. So we had a London system on the board after these opening moves, and this is a weapon which actually does hold some venom at the top level. You know, we've seen Alireza Firouzja use this quite successfully a few times. So these moves were very standard. Knight c6, the other knight came to d2 here, and now we had bishop g4. You can go with pawn e6 there, keep the bishop inside the pawn chain, but okay, Abdusattorov plays like this. Now we had pawn c3, we had a captures here in the centre, pawn to e6, and now the queen came to b3. So Levon is targeting this one because the bishop's come outside, and most commonly you see queen to c8 just holding that pawn. But I really like this idea from Nodirbek. So he plays bishop to d6, an aggressive concept where you're giving this pawn if white wants it. Now you don't want to take first, takes, and then take the pawn. Black can actually get castled here and has a better game than what we saw in the game. You know, the rook can come to the b file very quickly. You might well be winning the pawn back. As it was in the game, Levon took on here immediately. Then we had this bishop being captured, but white isn't losing a piece because you take this knight on c6 with check. The king comes to f8 here, and so not only has white won a pawn, but black has lost castling rights. So where's the compensation? Well, black has the bishop pair and is going to try and get a dynamic game, which is especially good when you're playing a strong player like Levon. So we had pawn g3, the bishop dropped back, the knight now came to e5 here, and you don't want to go giving up your bishop pair like this. That's a big asset in the position. So instead we had this move rook to b8, pressuring this pawn. We had pawn f3, hassling the bishop. It dropped back into f5 here, and you don't want to carry on hassling it with pawn to g4, or actually it can find a nice home on c2. This pawn's still under pressure, black's a bit better. So instead we had this move knight to b3. It covers the pawn there. You could have already castled, and we'll look at that in a moment, because pawn h5 was now played by Nodirbek, so he's trying to get something going on the king side. He's discouraging kingside castling and trying to activate this rook. And here Levon should probably castle as the best move here. You bring the king to safety, you cover this pawn, you open up the rook. Now he was maybe a bit hesitant with the bishop firing down here. We've got this rook on the b file, could be a bit scary, but as it was in the game, he went king to d2, and actually that king gets into some trouble in the centre of the board here. So here Nodirbek now gives up his bishop pair. A really interesting decision, but there is some logic to it, because after the pawn recaptures, he's now clearing pieces off of that d file, preparing for d4 soon. Now first he has to take care of the knight, so it drops back into d7, he attacks this pawn here. You could defend with f4, though you give a lovely move like this. If the rook slides away, we go h4, we can see black's getting a nice initiative here. So instead of going pawn f4, Levon defends like this to start with. We had rook b6 hitting the queen, it dropped into a4, black brought his queen to c7, covers this pawn, pressures here, and now Levon is forced to go f4, but first he throws in a check. The king slides to g8, and now the pawn is defended. And here I really love how top players just switch plans at the right moment in time. So you could carry on with pawn to h4 here, But then g4 is an interesting reply. If you take that one, now bishop d3 can come. You've claimed this diagonal, you've opened the g file, some rooks could be coming here, pawn f5 coming. Suddenly white is the one attacking black. Now you don't have to take that pawn here, you could go bishop e4, but the point being there's a lot of play going on that side of the board now. Instead, Nodirbek correctly assesses, don't push the pawn there, instead go king h7. He still could have got an okay game like that, but by playing like this, he starts putting the pressure on black in the centre of the board. So bishop e2 now came, and again, he doesn't meekly defend this pawn with g6, then h3 could come, maybe g4 soon, very scary. He goes rook to b8 here instead, playing on that side of the board, giving Levon this pawn which is snapped off, because now here's the follow-up, pawn to d4. Now you can't take with the pawn here, or queen c2 check comes, and that's just devastating. After king e3, can you see how you crash through here? You simply take this knight on b3. After the pawn recaptures, the rook jumps in, we're checking queen and king, that's game over. So we didn't have pawn takes. If you take with the knight in this position here, there's equally bad problems after rook takes on b2. So that pawn is actually immune, an excellent break in the centre of the board. So Levon goes g4, drumming up his own play on that side of the board. And again, really precise from Nodirbek, he simply ignores the threat to his bishop. Now you could go knight c5 here as a very strong move. Again, just pressuring this piece, pressuring the pawn behind. Instead, Nodirbek takes like this, also a good move, ripping open the d file. The pawn was recaptured, and now the queen hits c4, so that after the bishop is captured, you can capture here with check. The king moves away, and you take this one with the knight now. Rook h to f1 was tried, hitting the queen, and now again, really precise from Nodirbek. You want to check on the d file, but if you go with the rook, then the king can slide to c2, and it also covers this pawn. Now if you go queen c4, threatening to check here, your queen was attacked, remember, so you had to move it. Well, then bishop e2 can come, covers this square, you can't take on c3, it's covered by the king. If we come back here, however, Nodirbek didn't check with the rook, he went queen c4, and now he is threatening to check here. If you try bishop e2 this time, we simply win that pawn, that's a winning position. So we didn't have bishop e2, rook f2 was tried instead, covering this rank. Now we had knight d3, forking those rooks. The rook moved here, and now the queen took on c3. You don't even have to rush to take that rook. You can't move it away. Say you tried rook f1, well, we're simply crashing through again like this. After pawn recaptures, rook takes, there's just way too many problems against the queen in the back rank here. So we didn't have rook f1 played. Instead, the bishop took on f7. Again, Aronian just wants a couple of moves to attack the black king, but he just doesn't have time. Rook d8 was played, threatening all sorts of uncovered checks. The rook came to d2, knight f2 check, king e2. The rook captured here, and now the knight took in the game, but if you slide the king back, then we go queen h3 check. After king g1, there are different ways to mate the white king here, but the quickest is actually queen f3. You're threatening to move the knight away now here, so say you take the rook, well, as well as being able to take the queen, we can actually do this, and that's actually checkmate. So coming back to this position here, the knight took on d2 instead, but now the queen dropped on a3. The king took here, queen c5 check came, rook e3, and probably Levon would have resigned if this was a classical game. But okay, it's rapid, the time is ticking down. The pawn now took on f5, king e2 was played, the rook hit h6, threatening here, knight f3 defended, now pawn f4 kicked that rook, we had rook e5, and now a nice decoy tactic was played if you want to pause and look for it. So we had rook takes on h2, and you can't take back or you lose your rook here. Another really nice shot, they're so tactically aware, these young guys. So we didn't have knight takes, king d3 was played, queen c2 check, king d4. We had a few more checks like this, and then again Nodirbek just plays really simply. He gives up that pawn here to win the rook, and simplify down into a winning endgame like this. The queen came to d6, pinning that knight. King e4, pawn g5 was played, and after bishop b3, queen f6, here Levon threw in the towel. There's no decisive blow right now, but ultimately these pawns, along with the queen, are going to win the game against the exposed king and minor pieces. If you enjoyed this game and want to see Abdusattorov playing Carlsen, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.